Take a moment and think about the worst project you've ever been on. Partner up with somebody and talk about that project for the next minute. What was it? What made it awful? So I'm going to give you a bit of time to do that. Yes, you have to interact. $15 more seconds. Okay, listen this way for a bit. Come back to me. So you've talked about the worst project you've ever been on. Think about the best project you've ever been on and talk about that for the next minute. Okay, 15 more seconds. Listen this way. Come back to me. So let's establish this right now. This is a safe harbor, right? And we're all interested in learning more about how we can make our project successful. So the more we can share our experiences, the better off we're going to be. This is a conversation amongst us, and my job is to keep us moving in the right direction. It's not going to be me yelling at you for the next 47 minutes or whatever. So, I'm going to ask you to be brave and to share with other people what were the things that made the difference between the bad project and the good project. And if you're willing to share, please put your hand up and we'll get a microphone over to you.
Hello, I'm a project manager right now. I think the big difference between a good project and a bad project is people.
Okay, so people.
I used to be a project manager. For me, the difference that made the difference between a great and a terrible project is clarity of definitions and setting goals. Where this clarity wasn't present, there was chaos, there was misunderstanding, conflict, and when there is this clarity from the beginning, you immediately have a group of people, which I think is also very important, who are pushing together to get to those well-defined goals.
Great. Anyone else?
It's actually what you're going to deep talk about today. It's all that upfront hard work that has to be done before we even start, and clarifying what the expectations are, who the stakeholders are, and so on and so forth.
So it's the front end loading of effort in some respects. It's clarity, it's people. One more? Yes, up at the back there.
Senior management support.
Yeah. Okay. So the difference between the good project and the bad project, we put our fingers on some of the switches for that. It doesn't matter whether your project is predictive, kind of the myth of waterfall, okay? Whether it's more adaptive, more the myth of agile. We need to get things set up so we know where we're going. How much we need to know can be determined by the kind of projects that we're doing. So things that we're going to talk about pretty quickly over the next hour or so. One, making sure the business case is still valid. Identifying our sponsors, and that's a much more tricky thing than we think it is. The roles and responsibilities that we have as PMs, identifying and engaging stakeholders. If I had to give you the one-word version of what I'm going to say for the next 40 minutes or so, that word would be communicate. All right? And then we'll talk about getting approval of the project charter as well. If you're in a charter environment, if it's not a chartered environment, there'll be something that serves in the role of or in lieu of the charter. So, how often have you perhaps been an executional project manager, work's been done in the past, and now you're coming into the present and they say, great, here we go. This is what we need done. Here's your budget. Away you go. Anyone been there? Put your hands up if that's been your circumstance. For a lot of us, it's the reality, isn't it? Well, I can promise you that the worst projects I've been on have been ones where I blindly accepted that here is what needs to be done and here is your funding. What do we need to do before we move forward on that, do you think? Just go ahead and call it out. Challenge. Yes. When was the business case created? When was the charter created? How many cycles or years or decades have passed since the funding was assigned? Is the funding even adequate? Too often, I have asked, so what is the relationship between what you want to have happen and the funding that we've placed against the project? And too often the answer is, that's what we want to have done, and that's what was left over from the other project. Is that going to work? What do you think? So, if there's not a clear relationship between the activities and the funding available, what is likely to happen to us? Go ahead and just call it out. Fail. Fail from a number of reasons. Not the least of which, it's really embarrassing when you run out of money before you run out of project. Right? Think about the scope, the time, and the cost, those issues. If you don't have adequate funding to achieve the project, what do you need to do? What are your options? So I heard somebody say get more money, which in the happy land, we are not currently in happy land, in case you haven't noticed. I have never had someone come by and say, oh, look, you're doing well on the project, here's an extra 50% of money because we like you so much. But I have definitely had people come by and say, your project's going pretty well. Those three are on fire, so we're taking 2/3 of your money. By the way, you still have to deliver the whole thing. Is that going to work? So if we don't have enough money, enough funding, enough resources to do the project, I heard someone say, examine scope. So we all know, fast tracking and crashing and so on as ways to try and improve the speed of a project or perhaps reduce the costing. The harsh reality is that the only way I know to be certain that I'm going to reduce the required resourcing for a project is to adjust scope to fit. And boy, oh boy, is that ever an unpleasant conversation. But here's the reality about that. If we delay unpleasantness, we have bigger unpleasantness to deal with. If the conversation is we only have enough money to achieve 40% of the project and fail is set at not making 60% of the project, are we further ahead to not do the project? What do you think? Yeah. Because if we expend that money and fail, that money's not available for something else. If we recognize that the project is not doable and we don't do the project, what happens with that other money? It becomes available to take on a project that might be doable in that timeline. Is the project lined up with the critical requirements of the organization? How many people are in organizations here where there is project portfolio management in place? Very few, right? So if we don't have a way of aligning with the strategic goals, how are we going to know that we're doing the right project? Do strategic goals have to always be set at the highest level of the enterprise or organization? Can strategy be set at a divisional or a departmental level? So we want to ensure whatever we're doing is lined up with where we want to go as a group, as an organization. We've talked about our expectations realistic. If you have ever worked a 75-hour project week, stand up. Nobody's worked 75 hours in a week? Yeah. How many people have worked 75-hour weeks back to back to back until you cease to be effective and we're now producing less than you would have produced at 40 hours a week? I have. I have been the good pony many times. And the pony ran, so they put more on the pony's back. The pony kept running. They put more on the pony's back. The pony was still trying to move forward when all four legs flipped out from underneath and the pony slapped down onto its belly and went, ugh. Did I help my project by doing that? No. So if we set up unrealistic expectations for performance, unrealistic expectations for speed, unrealistic expectations for engagement, what are we setting ourselves up for? And yet, I've worked with many clients who refuse to hear that. That we just find a way. And I'm a big find a way kind of guy, but it has to be reasonable. Telling me that I'm going to England for next Thursday by swimming the Atlantic, probably not going to work out well for anybody. Right? Least of all the shark who eats me somewhere in the middle of the ocean. And the edicted project, when people say, this is what I want, this is what you have, this is what you must do, is almost always, in my experience, a project that's being set up for failure. This means we have to have the courage to speak forthrightly, maybe even verging on bluntly at times, about what the real world of the project is, rather than the desired fantasy. If you know your project sponsor, stand up. Okay? Come on, stand up if you know who your sponsor is. You don't need to know them on a social level, but do you know who the sponsor is on your project? Less than half. Okay, thank you. Why do you need to at least know who your sponsor is? If you're the PM and you don't know who your sponsor is, what world are you in? Are you in the happy world? If you don't know your sponsor, what about the unofficial sponsors? So all too often we have the sponsor who's been, and I'm going to be very blunt here, sometimes made the sponsor because they were the only person not at the meeting when the selection was made for who was going to be sponsor. And then, given no training whatsoever as to what their role actually is, can we expect them to do a good job? Only if you, as the PM, take the time to enlighten them as to their role. Most people think the sponsor's job is to say, and you'll all do very well. The sponsor's real job is to defend your project from the wolves that always circle looking for funds, looking for money that can be taken from one project to support another project. Your sponsor needs to sit at the high table, and when someone says, oh, I don't think that project's very important, if it is important, they need to get up on their hind legs and say, my project is important, and here's why. Because if we don't have a sponsor who defends our project, we will have erosion of our resources. What about the role between the sponsor and the PM? Have you ever had a sponsor who insisted on being part of the project team? So in a traditional role, we would see project team, kind of a hierarchy here, the project team, the project manager, the project sponsor. And the sponsor is a high-powered creature, and I typically wouldn't want the sponsor wandering around talking to the project folk without me being involved. Why? Think about that for a second. Why don't I want the sponsor wandering around without me being involved? Well, I'll tell you a story. Okay, yes?
They might try to assign responsibilities to people on your project team that are different than what you've assigned, or they might
Might be a lot of side trying to assign different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're reaching past the project manager and affecting daily life of the project team. This is an actual true story, not just for illustration purposes. On a project creating a new planning office for the organization, so an IT planning operation, I came on board to be the PM, and I met my sponsor. Crackerjack person, really bright, really smart. She's the incoming manager for this office. And she makes a request that seems to be logical. She says, I'm going to be the manager. The project team are all the people who are going to be working in this new office. I would really like to be on the team as well so I can get to know them. And I backpedaled a little bit, thinking quickly, how can I make this not so? Because I know this is going to be problematic. I explain why I think this is perhaps not a great idea. And she says, not to worry, I will always remember whether I'm speaking as the sponsor or as the team member. Do, do, do. Additional challenges for this project. Office space was almost impossible to find, so everyone worked from their home location, whether that was a corporate location or actually their home, and we did an awful lot by telephone, more than I would have liked. When we got together, I watched, and we'll call this sponsor Juliet. That's not her real name, just in case she's in the audience. I saw Juliet mixing the role of sponsor and team leader. And I thought for a little bit and said, there's got to be a way to fix this. I came in with 2 baseball caps, and I said, when you are the team member, please wear the blue baseball cap. When you are the sponsor, please wear the white baseball cap. I thought this was a marvelous solution. She did not. Before too long, we're doing things like the weekly status meeting. And so, Pete, what are you doing? Charlie, what are you doing? Betty Ann, what are you doing? Whoa, whoa, whoa. What are you working on, Betty Ann? And it's something that's not even in the project plan. And I said, why are you working on that? And she said, well, Juliet said I could. You can see how, exactly as you predicted, the project started to have 1.5, 1 3/4, maybe even 2 project managers in play. And what we were not doing very well because of our scattered environment, communication. And it caused us a lot of extra grief. In big organizations, often there's an appointed sponsor who has the badge that says, I am the sponsor. But there are also informal sponsors. Have you ever worked in an environment where the sponsor was really not the decision maker, but someone else was? And was that person undefined in the project? They might be there as a project team member, but the sponsor takes their advice from that person. So contrary to what you might have heard, I don't stalk my sponsors, okay? But I study them. I like sponsors who smoke because I can find them, right? I know if I go down to the smoking area, within a certain amount of time, I'm going to see them. I don't smoke, but I've probably spent 1/3 of my career in smoking areas, right? I know where they go for coffee. I know when they go for coffee. A lot of times, in order to convince or to complete the communication loops, I need to have informal sessions. And if there's informal sponsors or unofficial sponsors, I need to have sessions with them as well. One of the things I've found on some projects is the sponsor, because they know they don't know the role of the sponsor, is basically taking everything to someone else and saying, what should I do? Well, if that person's in play, I need to have a relationship with them as well. So, let's talk about the role of a PM. The role is what we do, our tasks. Our responsibility is what do we have the authority to decide upon, to approve something, to say, yes, this is complete and good. Take a moment, think about the best project manager you've ever worked for. It might have been a direct relationship. It might be perhaps something a little less formal, a mentoring. Think about who that person is. Take the next 30 seconds and think about that. What were the characteristics that made them the good PM? I'm going to ask you to share, if you would. Okay. Yeah. So good people skills, good management of communication, and coming back to it being about people. Absolutely. Without people, we can't do projects. And to quote one of my best mentors, if it wasn't for all the people involved, project management would be such a great gig. In reality, of course, without the people, we can't achieve anything. What else made that person a really good project manager? Decisive. Willing to make a decision. Okay. Yes?
Ability to see the big picture.
The big picture vision. And boy, that's something we need to do more of, isn't it? That I've tried to teach myself, and I don't always succeed in this, that as soon as I see something that surprises me, instead of saying, that's wrong, I say, take 2 steps back, take a look at it, and ask yourself, why is this so? Right? And that is a different conversation than this is wrong. What else makes a good project manager? Transparency. They say what they're going to do, and they do what they say they will do. And perhaps equally as important, they say what they will not do, and then they don't do it. Right? What else? So, having the technical and the interpersonal skills and knowledge. Okay? Anything else? Comfortable challenging the status quo. Having that moral courage to ask the questions that need to be asked. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Political acuity, knows what's going on in the organization.
Knows what's going on in the organization, political acuity. Yeah, the best PMs I know have got antennas about 15 feet long. And they're always tasting the air and sensing what's going on. Because what's one of our roles? To clear the road for the project, right? To move the logs out of the way. Well, if we know where the logs are, we can maybe choose a different path altogether. Or get there early enough that the project team never knows there was the difficulty. Quick question. What's a stakeholder? Outside of vampire movies, What's a stakeholder? Yeah.
Anybody who can or can be affected by the project.
Absolutely.
Is or can be affected by the project.
Yeah, so anyone who could be or is affected by the project. Yep.
I like that, but I want to go on through can affect.
And can bring effect upon the project as well. Okay, so I did a project for the Ministry of Health. How many people live in Ontario? At that time, about 12.5 million. How many stakeholders did we have on the project that was affecting how health services were delivered? 12.5 million. That was the world's biggest town hall meeting I ever attended. Okay, realistically, did we put 12.5 million people into a room and have a chat? No. So what did we do? We identified key stakeholders, representative stakeholders, and so on, and brought them into play. There are more stakeholders on projects than we realize. When you take your bank card out and stick it in the ATM and say, give me money, for the duration of that transaction, are you a stakeholder in that bank's ATM system? Absolutely. And you'll know that if your card ever doesn't come back out. Let's talk about project charters for a second. Do you have charters on your projects? There's no wrong answer here. Okay. Lots of yeses. Anyone that doesn't have a charter on their project? Okay. So what is a charter? What does a charter do for us? It is an encapsulation of our understanding at this point of what we're going to do, how long it's going to take, and what resources we have to bring to bear upon it. It serves as the contract between the project manager and the sponsor and organization as to what's going to be done with things. Does a charter have to be a formal document? Eventually, in some fashion. I can tell you how old I am. I've started projects with the charter written on the inside of a cigarette package. Right? Here's what needs to be done, here's how long you have, here's how much money you have, and away you go. Eventually that was translated into a more formal document, but as long as I had approval of the sponsor, I was able to move forward. We often get caught up on signage. Has it been signed? If you read the PMBOK, it says it must be approved. It doesn't indicate what the approval mechanism is. Would I want some kind of enduring document that says I had this approval? Yeah, but it might be an email saying, blah, 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 blah. Do you agree? Yes. Do I have your approval to move forward? Yes. We've talked about communication. I've done a lot of project rescues over my career, partly because I'm broke in some fashion and I like the stress and terror. I can predict with almost 100% certainty if I'm called to talk about a project rescue, I'm going to find a project that is not communicating well. On one project, client will remain nameless, rescue mission came in, watching the team interact, and the project manager, as smart as Sheldon from The Big Bang. Okay? Brilliant. Unfortunately had the interpersonal skills of Sheldon from The Big Bang. A direct quote, when queried on something during a meeting, she said, "Fine, I'll put it in terms even you people can understand." Can you make any prediction about the state of relationships between the team and the project manager? Can you make a prediction about the state of relationship between the sponsor and the project manager? Communication is a big deal, and we need to think about communication at this stage. And how are we going to communicate? Not what we're going to communicate, but what are we going to communicate? So we've covered that already, except this one here is important. Who are we doing the project for? Who are we doing the project to? What's the difference between to and for? And this is what's interesting. If we think about it in terms of for rather than to, we will usually get better results. Because when we're doing projects to people, we tend to forget to communicate. We'll take the old machines away. They have no choice but to use the new ones. That didn't work well in the 70s, and it doesn't work at all today. Right? What if we had a plan where we put people into communication about what's going on and why? One of the things I found in communication is all too often we leave out the little bit of information that changes it from an order to an understanding. Working on a project, a change project, for a large electrical distribution company, I looked out into the parking lot and thought, isn't that strange? And I actually mentioned this aloud to my colleague. For an organization that is absolutely dedicated to the processes of safety, like every meeting starts with, let's have a safety minute kind of thing. I see most of the cars have pulled into their parking spots nose first. And I said, that's strange because you're supposed to back into parking spots. And one of my colleagues said, yeah, really, Reg, what's the big deal? Either I back in or I back out. One way or the other, I go forward and I go backwards. And I said, but think about this. When you back into the parking spot, it's a controlled environment. Right? There's not going to be somebody come ripping down the line of parked cars at 60 miles an hour. But when you back out into the lane, it's an uncontrolled environment. And she looked at me and said, that makes perfect sense. Okay, I'll do that from now on. But without that little piece of information, just the back into parking spot was just an edict again, wasn't it? Stakeholder engagement. How are you going to plan your engagement? What are you going to do to engage stakeholders? These are all things you need to have figured out at a very high level during initiation. The more effort we put into the initiation, the smoother our project tend to go. And that really great mentor I had at some points would growl at me when I was taking a little bit of a light approach to initiation, and he would say, do you want to plan hard, initiate hard, and have an easy project? Or do you want to have an easy initiation and then fight crocodiles, alligators, and anacondas all the way through your project because you didn't set things up right? How can we communicate with our stakeholders? What kind of mechanisms might we use for communication? Just go ahead and call them out. Town hall. Email. A newsletter, whether electronic or perhaps even physical. Right? The most effective and richest form of communication, unfortunately also the most expensive form of communication. But think about how quickly we can solve things face to face as compared to in distance. So I was on a project in Mexico, and at that point I didn't speak Spanish, so I was operating in English in a mostly Spanish environment. We completed the work at the first plant. The next plant's about 4 hours away. So I pick up the phone and I call the plant manager and say, hey, Juan Carlos, this is Reg. We're pretty much wrapped up here, so I'm told it's about 4 hours to get to where you are. And he says, yeah, right. I'm like, whoa, who put what in his cornflakes this morning? Okay, well, anyway, listen, I think it would be a good way to start if you got your team together. I'm going to have my gang with me. Why don't we meet for lunch? Because we should get there about noon, and we can start that way. I think that'll be fine. And he says, yeah, right. Had it been 10 years earlier in my career, I would have gone to the second plant, ready for war. There's obviously some reason he doesn't want me coming to this plant. They've got things that they're hiding, whatever. We get to the restaurant, shaking hands, twinkling eyes, smiles. Juan Carlos, it's a pleasure to meet you. He says, yeah, right. Whoever taught him English said, and if you really, really agree, you say, yeah, right. Can you see, though, how quickly I could have taken that piece and had let it sour my entire view and probably sour the relationship and result in a very difficult project? Good ideas can come from anywhere. Right? What other mechanisms might we use to engage? How about focus groups? What about working groups? What about things that are off the chart that you won't find in the PMBOK? For a large project affecting about 13,000 people, and about 6,000 of them were in one building in one location, they were terrified of what they heard about the project. Because what does everyone think every project's about? Getting rid of people. Right? And this project was going to change things that had been in place for 30 years. People's entire careers had been spent inside that one system. 69 independent systems collapsing into one integrated system. The level of fear was very high. They didn't hear what we said at town halls. They didn't come to meetings. How can we engage? I put a kiosk in the lobby of the building, and it had our project name on a banner. And I had muffins. Enough muffins for 6,000 people. People would come in and they'd say, oh, what's this? Wobble, 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 wobble. And come, what's this? And I or one of my team would say, if you can tell me the name of our project, I'm going to give you a muffin. And if we just got that, say, if you can tell me the name of my project, I'm going to give you a muffin. And if that didn't work, we said, the most project, which is our name, is pleased to present you with a muffin. I did not want 6,000 muffins left over. Was that a form of communication? Yeah. It associated a pleasant experience with our project name. It worked well enough that we did it in all the satellite offices as well. We need to know, are we good communicators? So, if you're a good communicator, put up your hand. If your spouse thinks you're a good communicator, keep your hand up. We need to work on our own communication skills constantly and ruthlessly because we live in a world where it's easy to pretend to communicate. A few weeks ago, I was sitting at home watching the news, my wife on the couch, and she's talking, and I'm pretending to listen. I'm saying, yep, uh-huh, sure, okay. All of a sudden, boom, TV goes black. I said, what happened? She says, well, I just want to thank you so much. Chill down my spine. Thank me so much for what? And she says, well, I thought it would be a lot bigger sell to get you to agree to spend $37,000 on a ring for our 37th anniversary. And I said, there's no way on the planet that I agreed to that. And she picked up her phone and hit playback. I was pretending to communicate. I had let my own communication skills fall. One of the hardest things to do is to see ourselves as others see. Right? And something that is going to be probably a little painful is get a trusted third party to tell you about your communication skills. Yeah. I was fortunate in that in my later teens, someone I trusted took me aside and said, do you have any idea how you come across? Because I thought I was displaying a dry, sardonic wit. What people thought I was a condescending son of a bitch. Okay? So we need to challenge ourselves. So what's the killer of projects? What's the number one killer of projects? Okay, communication's at the root, but what's higher up than that? Scope creep? What's the cause of scope creep? Mismanaged expectations. Mismanaged expectations are the result of poor communication. 30 years ago, we thought that the skill set of a project manager was about 50% technical abilities, 25% methodologies, and 25% communications. Today, it's at least thirds, and we expect it to eventually be more than 50% of the PM skill set is in communication. How do we get better at communication? Well, if I know I'm not very, oh yes, go ahead. Develop our listening skills. Superb. Most of us are pretty good at telling people what we want. We're not very good at hearing what people are saying to us, and good information can come from anywhere. Right? There's a fellow I work with on a charity board that I've been on for a long time, and this is going to sound awful about me, but it's the truth. When that person begins to speak, I can feel my ears sucking themselves shut. Because there has never been, nor ever shall there be, anything of worth issue from that man's pie hole. You know what? I'm 100% wrong. Good ideas can come from anywhere, and if I'm not hearing them, then I won't get that good idea. What if we know that communication skills isn't one of the best things that we have? What could you do to address that as part of your thinking and initiation? And remember that initiation isn't just at the start of the project. It's a phase, it's not a phase rather, it's a process group that we may play out many times over a project. So if you know you're perhaps not as good as you would like to be in communication, what might you do in thinking about your project and initiation? Well, if you don't have a skill, what can you do? If you don't know how to fix a car and your car needs to be fixed, what do? Take it to a mechanic, right? If you know that your communication skills aren't perhaps where you want them to be, that you need good communications on your project, what might you do? Get some communicators on the team, right? On a large government project where I had a 50-person change management team, I had documenters, I had trainers, and I had stakeholder engagement people who were specialized in dealing with the groups we were dealing with. Now, this was all to do with taxation and kind of a touchy area at the best of times, but they were able to communicate to the various groups more effectively than I could because they were inside the ministry and had existing relationships. As long as it's a positive relationship, you can build upon it. So, how do you do charters in your organizations? Take a minute and think about that, and then talk with your buddies. So we'll come back together in about 2.5 minutes. How do you do charters? What do they look like? Okay, listen this way. So how do you handle charters in your organization? Who wants to be bold and share? Not me. Okay, up. Templates. You have a template that you need to complete. Okay. Anyone else?
We've been taught too many times. It was lessons learned because students are procrastinators, and Keith and I, who's doing Procept, started the whole concept of charters to make them start thinking about their culminating assignment early.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we put in there was that they should identify their project and their key references
Mm-hmm.
early. Because again, lessons learned. Some of the student teams were coming to us and saying, well, we chose our project early and you approved it, but now we can't find any references for it. So we have to change. And I said, you've got 2 weeks left. You don't have time to change.
Mhm.
So you have to do some more digging. So yeah, that's the way we learn, we use the charter to make sure that the project that they're proposing is actually valid and has enough information that they can actually write a paper on it.
Yeah. Great. The way I think about a charter is if I don't know where I'm going, how do I know what road to take? Right? All too early in a lot of projects, we jump to a solution to what we see as the problem and we say, we'll do this. But we haven't thought out all the pieces. And early in my career, there was a lot of times that we did a great job of the wrong project. That it didn't actually address the real need. So again, it's a little bit step back, think about it, document it. If you don't know what completed looks like, when does your project end? Okay. We're still working on it. Yeah. So this is funny, but it's true. I once attended the 7th anniversary party for the 1-year special project. Because every time it got close to being completed, someone would say, well, we're at this, and boom, scope creep. But then they would go and find money, so if you have funding for it, it's no longer scope creep, it's now a change control issue, isn't it? Right? And they just kept going on 1 year at a time. I've also been on projects where the project was declared complete because we had no more money. So wherever we got to was the definition of done. The problem is, of course, that that definition seldom meets the need. So there are some pitfalls around the charter, aren't there? How deep do you go in detail in the charter? I have some clients who have a template that if you complete it, the charter is 2.5 centimeters thick if you printed it out. Because it includes, it's not the charter, it's the risk plan, it's the communications plan, it's the schedule, it's the resourcing. And when I challenge them and say, why do you do this? Because you're doing all this work before you get approval. And they say, in our environment, we will only get eyes on this once. So we have to put everything into the charter so that we can show that we're good to go. You know, a lessons learned in their environment was a light charter often then didn't result in the detailed planning that was supposed to happen following the charter. Right? What's another pitfall? The other side of the game, where the charter is so high in the sky that it doesn't provide the guidance necessary. So we need to think about that as well. It's funny, in almost everything, there's a boundary over here and a boundary over here, but the happy place is somewhere on that slider back and forth. And because projects are done by people, the people will drive the degree of detail needed in the charter. When I had the same team for 3 different projects, but the projects were relatively similar, the third charter was much lighter in detail because I had trust relationships. I knew who I was going to be using, I knew their skills, I knew their communication abilities. So that's part of the issue there. The other thing is, big charters don't get read. Right? When you put that 1 inch or 2.54 centimeter stack in front of somebody, they say, no, I'm not going to read that. Tell me, does it cover all it needs to cover? And you say yes. And they say, okay, then go ahead. And you say, can you sign? Not yet. Right. So realistically, in a lot of organizations, sadly, charters are signed when the project is near completion because they say, okay, it came true, I can sign it now and I won't be in trouble. A friend of mine is a senior VP for an engineering company. They build these almost 100-story buildings. And I foolishly invited him to speak at a session without making sure I knew what he was going to say. Classic error number 1. So I turned to him and said, so Joel, at ABC Engineering, when do you do the project charter? Fully expecting him to say, well, of course, we do charter as part of the initiation of our projects. He says, yeah, we do the charters at close. He says, well, that way they match the project. You don't want to do that because it means that they ran without guidance for a long time. So, questions? Anything you'd like to ask me? Yes?
So question around sponsors who keep changing direction. Any innovative strategies for dealing with them beyond continuously saying, look at the charter?
Okay, so the question is, sponsors who keep changing direction. Anyone been on that project? We run this way for 5 weeks, then we run this way for 5 weeks, then we run backwards over this way for 5 weeks. I've been on that project, have you? Okay. So what can we do? How can we get a better grip on that circumstance? Insist on using some kind of a change request system. Now, assuming, so there's 2 definitions here we got to work on. There's before the charter is completed and there's after the charter is completed. I think you're talking more about after the charter is completed, right? Because before it's completed, that's just a change in thinking and we haven't spent a lot of money on things. After the charter is complete, making that change needs to go through some kind of a change request process where there's a review of the impact on the project, and that means time and cost, scope. One of the crazy things I've discovered is that as soon as I put a price tag on things, a lot of them go away, right? Because people tend to think, well, you're doing the project anyway, why can't we have 4 floors and a rooftop pool on the 2-story building? Right? And you say, so In order to protect the relationship with the sponsor, you don't want to become Captain No. No, 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 no. So what I do is I always say, isn't that interesting? Let's think about how it would affect our project. And then come back and say, 2 more floors, is going to cost N $100,000. The rooftop pool, well, considering we've got a 60-degree pitch on the roof, it's going to be tough, so we're going to have to put a flat roof on at additional cost. And usually by that point they're going, oh, okay, well, never mind then. The key thing is communicate. You want to be a good communicator with your sponsor, and I find that usually that means I have to be the initiator of the communications. I'll ask the sponsor right up front, how much communication do you want from me? And often they'll say, well, you're item 19 on my 10-item plate, so if you can come back only when there's problems, that would be great. Do you know the difficulty if you follow that advice? Only come back when there's problems? You are the person always coming in and saying, this is a crisis, this is a problem, and never giving good information. So I would find ways to engage. It's really about relationships. Okay.
At the beginning of the presentation, you talked about getting projects that is not you, and having a started with you. So if you're that unlucky person, you get a project, or in my case, a suite of projects that are about to fail. How do you handle that?
Okay, so you've walked into the building and they said, surprise, you're the project manager of this. Don't worry, we've done all the planning for you. All you have to do is deliver. Is that basically the circumstance? You run away. Actually, in all seriousness, as a contracting PM, I will often take a look at that, and if they're not willing to discuss where these things came from, then I will probably not engage on the project. I'm a professional outsider. I can get away with that. If you don't have that luxury, then it's a matter of finding a way to do a good job with what you have. A lot of communication, a lot of questions, and be careful how you phrase the questions. You don't want to say, why did you do this? Because that's aggressive. But if you say, what made the team think about this way, that's a lot less aggressive, but it's the same message. Very often it's not the content of our messaging, it's how we wrap it up that causes the problem. So initiation, remember, is more than just at the front of a project. You might have it at various times. You might have different pieces of the project launching at different times. Be aware that it sets the tone. The better job you do here, the easier your project will be. And thank you very much for your time and attention.